Welcome back. You're watching France 24. Coming up at the top of the hour, we'll of course have the latest on this attack that took place in the Lyon area, which is now on maximum terror alert after the decapitation of an employee of a subcontractor, rather, at a U.S.-owned gas and chemical firm. The presumed attacker, one of his employees. The French prosecutors says that there's no indication the attack suspect had an accomplice. 4 people are in custody, though, including his wife and his sister. It's part of a bloody Friday with at least 37 killed as a gunman sprayed bullets at bathers at a Tunisian beach resort. Irish, British, German, and Belgian tourists among the casualties. Elsewhere, more than 24 dead as a Shiite mosque was targeted in Kuwait. Greece's prime minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting after an EU summit that concluded without a deal to avoid a default next week. We'll have more on that in the world this week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. We're in the company of Sylvie Kaufmann of a French newspaper Le Monde, of David Chazan of the Daily Telegraph, Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review, and Ana Navarro-Pedro of Visão. Tell us about Visão.
Visão, it's very well said. It's a Portuguese weekly magazine, very good one.
All right. We were talking before the break about surveillance being stepped up. Judah Grunstein is making the point. The French Prime Minister, who described all the surveillance measures that have been enacted since January when there was the Paris terror attack. Sylvie Kaufmann, when you note that this is a week where the final draft of a bill was passed by the French Parliament, some have called it the French Patriot Act, what is going to be the upshot of an attack like the one that we witnessed today?
Well, we will have to see whether this suspect who is being held had been closely monitored, whether he was known from the police services, but was he? If he was indeed a really difficult, dangerous individual, was he properly monitored? And so that may be relevant in the context of the new bill.
It's the old adage: you can't put a gendarme behind every tree.
Absolutely. I mean, and you need more than one gendarme to monitor properly one individual, I guess.
But nevertheless, if it does turn out that this attacker had been flagged up to the intelligence services, as had the Kouachi brothers, as had Mohamed Merah before the killings in the south of France, then it does start to become a little bit sensitive and embarrassing for the intelligence establishment, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, but you may say this again. There's no 100% protection. I mean, look at the measures that you have in force in the US, and that didn't prevent the Boston attacks to happen. So you never have a perfect system. So that may play into the arguments that we don't need such a collection of metadata systems. But the fact is that we're going back to what we said at the beginning. You'll never have a perfect protection. I think
there's also in surveillance and in counterterrorism. There's also something that is the biggest problem for the people who are trying to track these people. It's when the target goes dark. So apparently, from the initial reports, the perpetrator here was being followed for a while. He didn't engage in any more suspicious behavior. So they follow for a while, but there's a certain point where if the person being followed isn't doing anything that actually warrants paying more attention, you have to manage your resources, and you have to ask, is it worth spending money on having someone follow this person when there might be someone more dangerous? And so that whole idea, when a target goes dark, whether it's because their behavior becomes less suspicious or because their communication sort of falls off the radar, the intelligence agency has to make a decision, and that's a human decision. And at that point, if if the person never ends up doing anything, it's the correct one. There's always going to be mistakes when humans are involved. And in this case, the tragic part is that they're often deadly mistakes.
All right, so spare a thought then for Tunisia, because here we're talking about a country where we've seen at least 37 killed. That toll is going to rise, unfortunately, they think. This is more than during the attack on the Bardo Antiquities Museum in Tunis back in March. And it isn't a case of a few dozen sleeper cells or whatever, a few dozen people, as has been people who follow this closely here in France say it's at most several hundred people who are capable of harming. In Tunisia, you've got lawless Libya, which is on the border.
Which on the border, you have a population that is increasingly poor and with no perspective of, of a decent future. From the first information we've got, it remains to be checked and verified. But first information was a student, fairly interesting, good-looking, normal, modern young man. He went into the beach with his gun hidden in beach wear, went for a swim, came back and started shooting at people. Is this the right version? Still remains to be seen, but this is the one that was being broadcast right after, from witnesses right after the killing. You're always going to find in Tunisia people. It does remind me of the young Italians that in the 70s we've heard about them that would go, with the Red Brigades and commit murders, attacks, terrorist attacks against the population or against targets in Italy. You're always going to find someone who is bound to fall for this type of action, but I think that in Tunisia it's not a lone wolf as we may have thought here in France. I think it's this action has a pilot somewhere, because they really want the country to go overboard and state institutions to fall.
I'm not sure if the number is still current, but there was a certain point where Tunisians, curiously, were among the biggest cohort going to Syria and returning, and it's something we don't necessarily associate with the country because it was one of the most westernized countries and also very much a surveillance state. But there was a big Tunisian cohort of
backlash against that, perhaps.
Jihadists.
Yeah, there's clearly a big Islamist movement there, but it's sad and ironic that Tunisia seems to be one of the few Arab countries that actually benefited from the Arab Spring and that did achieve important advances towards democracy. And this is going to hit them really hard. I mean, on the way here tonight...
Because the clear intent is tourism, is to...
Absolutely. On the way here tonight, my taxi driver said he just booked a holiday in Tunisia yesterday. Of course, he's not going to be going. It's their biggest foreign exchange earner. It's one of their biggest employers. If they lose the tourism barely 3 months after the attack on the museum, it's going to really hurt.
It's a disaster. I think it's a real tragedy for Tunisia. It's, as you pointed out, it's the only country from those where we had those revolts in 2011, which was clearly taking the democratic path, and it was really the only, maybe I shouldn't talk in the past sense, but it's the only one which presents really a serious hope. And of course, the economy is crucial, and the economy, a big part of the economy relies on tourism. This is just the beginning of the touristic season, and it's really tragic for Tunisia.
And when people lose their jobs, you create the conditions for more people to be radicalized.
Absolutely.
There's also this very macabre parallel to the migrant crisis that Europe is experiencing right now, which was discussed at the EU summit. I imagine we'll talk about it maybe later. But what's driving the people who are fleeing from North Africa? It's this kind of violence. It hits closer to home when it is European tourists on a beach in Tunisia that have been killed than when it is violence among North Africans that is making other North
Tunisian
Africans.
security forces have
But
been the target of attacks regularly.
But these are this is the kind of violence and instability that is driving the migrant crisis to Europe.
All right, and we're again asking the question, what is terrorism? A question that's been asked a lot the past 2 weeks in the United States after the shooting spree in an emblematic church in South Carolina. Barack Obama on hand to read the funeral elegy for Reverend Clementa Pinckney, pastor of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston this Friday. And that question of what is terrorism, and again, I've heard it today, David Chazan, people saying they're still not calling it terrorism in many circles in the United States.
I think it is undeniably terrorism in the sense that what does terrorism seek to do but scare people? You frighten a lot of people, you achieve a big result, a big spectacular news story with very few fighters, very little equipment, and probably not that much in the way of planning, or not the kind of planning that leaves an email or phone trace that the intelligence services and the security officials can easily trace and then try to nip the plot in the bud before it's actually carried out. So in a way, what happened in Tunisia today is straight out of a classic terrorism playbook, and by those standards, it's clearly been very successful, unfortunately.
On the subject of Charleston, and when he was running for president in 2008, Barack Obama gave a speech in Philadelphia where he disowned his own pastor who'd gone too far on the issue with racially charged remarks. In it, he said, "This union may never be perfect, but generation after generation has shown it can always be perfected." And he seemed to put a lot of hope in young people overcoming racism. There was talk at the time of a post-racial society in the U.S. What are your thoughts after what's happened?
At the same time, this is an issue that during his 2 mandates, he didn't push too hard on, because he was very cautious. He didn't want to be seen as because he was the first black president, he didn't want to be seen as addressing this issue too forcefully and maybe not too antagonized, I don't know. But the fact is now, towards the end of his second term, there has been those cases of police violence and, repeated police violence on black youth. And so it becomes really obvious that there is still a very big problem with racial issues. So he has to finally really speak out forcefully. One thing is there's also another problem, which is guns. And we've been talking about this forever in the US, this gun control issue, under Clinton, under every Democratic president has to deal with this. And I'm sorry, we're not doing any progress. And it's great to take off the Confederate flag, but the flag is not the only problem.
Anna Navarro-Pedro, are you disappointed in Barack Obama, or has he done the best he could on this?
If he had pushed, as Sylvie said, if he had pushed further this question, he would be seen as biased. So, and there are already so many attacks on him, such racial and hatred attacks on him, that he couldn't go any farther for sure. But I wonder if the curve of racial attacks and racial incidents in the United States has accompanied the curve of impoverishment of the population. I think there is a relation in our societies, United States, in Africa, in Europe, and I wonder if I would like to see those statistics put into graph.
It's important to say that there's been this period since the civil rights movement of an enormous progress for Black Americans in terms of their legal status in front of the law. At the same time, the history of race relations in the United States, when the question of terrorism comes up, the history of race relations in the United States, and it's very important to understand this, is the history of an institutionalized and often state-sanctioned terrorism against Black people. There's no other way to describe chattel slavery. There's no other way to describe lynching. There's no other way to describe Jim Crow before the civil rights movement. And after the civil rights movement, when Black people actually had recourse to the law, the courts were no longer on the side of racist terrorists. The police forces, on the other hand, are a little more of a mixed story. And the police violence against black people is another example of state-sanctioned terrorism against black lives, against black men predominantly. The question about Obama and his relationship, for instance, it's interesting that you brought up his relationship to his pastor, or his former pastor, Jeremiah Wright, who was very much a black nationalist, anti-colonialist in the tradition, in the African-American Christian Protestant tradition of black nationalism, anti-colonialism. As the President of the United States, Barack Obama could not afford to be associated with that current of thought. It's a current of thought, though, that is very prominent, and not just among poor people who might not have the educational tools to make the analysis, but it's very prominent among the growing black middle class and black upper class. In other words, economic progress does not necessarily mean that black Americans are feeling more integrated into the American system. The institutional racism remains, and the critique is becoming more radical.
But hasn't it been, whereas in the 1960s, desegregation happened because the federal government enforced it. They sent out the National Guard. We've seen this week the governor of South Carolina, it was a local initiative, say we don't want the Confederate flag anymore.
There are two contradictions that are sort of embedded in the DNA of America. The one is that it's a nation that was founded on the premise that all people are created equal, at the same time that there was an institution of chattel slavery that made objects out of human beings. And on the other hand, it's a country that is extremely, extremely religious, extremely pious, and extremely violent. And if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, for instance, in 1963, there was the Birmingham church bombing, which killed 4 young black girls, and it sort of galvanized over a series of time. There was the Montgomery bus boycott, but the violence against a religious institution, in America, violence is one thing, but religion is another. And violence against a religious institution often creates the kind of galvanizing opinion that does then legitimize change and state-ordered change.
All right, we'll see if that change continues. There could be change, but not of the good kind, for Europe next week. 50-50, according to Germany's hard-nosed finance minister. Those are the chances of reaching a deal at this point with Greece. Greece, which wants to avoid default and a possible exit from the Eurozone. An EU summit that broke up in Brussels failed to bridge the gap. Now it's back to a 4th Eurozone finance ministers meeting in 10 days. And creditors want a lot more from Athens.
The proposals are only increasing taxes, only increasing contributions, no cuts, not at all. Until now, Greece has by far the highest percentage of civil servants in relation to population.
All right, so Wolfgang Schäuble wants more. The Greek cabinet holding an emergency session this Friday. There's talk of ring-fencing Greece, the launch of capital controls to stop a run on banks. The Prime Minister, though, when he left that EU summit in Brussels, putting on a brave face.
The European Union foundation principles were democracy, solidarity, equality, mutual respect. These principles were not based on blackmails and ultimatum. And especially in these crucial times, no one has the right to put in danger these principles. The Greek government will continue decisively to give the fight in favor of these principles. We'll continue to give the fight on behalf of the European people and, of course, on behalf of the Greek people.
Sylvie Kaufmann, what does your crystal ball say now?
My guess is that, in the traditional European way, I mean EU way, it will go down to the last minute. We'll get an agreement, but the hard part will be for Tsipras to sell it to his friends in Syriza and his left-wing friends in his party. And I think then the ball will be in his court, and that's going to be really the hard part. How, does he
And what's your
sell the
reaction when you see
concessions?
Schäuble there, the finance minister, saying the Greeks they're not doing enough to cut spending?
Well, it is true. It is true, but it is very difficult. I mean, you have the extremes there. You have Schäuble is really heavy, defending the toughest line on this issue, and it's very difficult for the Greeks on the politically to accept this. But, it is true that the Greeks haven't done all their homework. At the same time, there will be also concessions from the German side. There have already been, and they will have to do it. That, as I say, it's the European way. But what is important also is that the Greek public opinion is very supportive of Tsipras, but is still apparently solid behind the euro. They still want to stay within the eurozone. So we have to find, the compromise. We have to find it.
All right, so they'll be muddling on the euro. However, when it comes to migrants, it's been a week, David Chazan, where we've seen this hole open up, and it was this time not north-south between Italy and its neighbors to the north, but east-west as well, between Hungary and the likes of Austria and Germany, finger-pointing about sending migrants back to where. It looks as though over this issue, Europe is coming undone.
It's certainly under a lot of pressure from far-right parties in France, in Hungary. There's a lot of anti-immigration groups now trying to put pressure on their governments not to agree to the European Commission's plan of sharing the migrants on a sort of a quota system and at least trying to resettle, say, 40,000 of them. And there's a lot of really strong feelings about why the migrants are coming to Europe and whether they should be allowed to come. And I think that maybe we need greater understanding of some of the circumstances, the terrible political repression and forced conscription into the army in the case of Eritrea, attacks on civilian areas by the government in the case of Sudan, all-out war in Syria. I mean, all of these things are conspiring to deprive a huge number of people of any hope of making a better life at home.
And yet, when there was on Tuesday this strike by dockers in the French port of Calais, the reaction of the British Prime Minister was to point the finger at Italy for not keeping migrants away from his border.
It was, yeah, because most of those people in Calais are presumed to have landed in Italy and moved north. And if you look at the numbers of migrants who are in Calais, they're now estimated to be about 3,000. A year or two ago, they were between 2,000 and 2,500. Now, every time you go up there, it's obvious that there are new people arriving in Calais every day. So consequently, that means an unknown number of them are going to the UK. Calais is not the terminus, and the UK just feels it has so many people from so many different countries that there is a threshold, and the Prime Minister, David Cameron, is under a lot of pressure because he's promised to bring the number of migrants below a certain level, and obviously he's failed to deliver on that promise. It could never really be kept, and so he's boxed himself into a bit of a corner. But if there is a solution to this problem, it has to be at the European level, and possibly at the global level, because how do you begin to tackle it?
At least at the Mediterranean level. I mean, the thing is, we tend to associate this with Syria and North Africa going on right now. But when you look at the Middle East over the last 10 years, there was an initial wave of Iraqi refugees that had only just begun to be reabsorbed, or rather, that had been just completely reabsorbed back to Iraq when the Syria conflict broke out. Essentially, at the European level, though, what you see is that it seems to be solidarity for good times, but not necessarily for bad, whether it's Greece or migrants.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. But I want to thank you, Judah Grunstein. I want to thank Sylvie Kaufmann, David Chazan, Ana Navarro Pedro. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to to James Creedon.
Good evening, Francois. So obviously a lot of reaction on news websites and social media to the events in Tunisia and in Isère today. A lot of people, to start first of all with Tunisia, the death toll having risen to 37 or even more, 99 days after the Bardo attack. That was, of course, a museum in Tunis that also was attacked. 22 dead, 21 of those 22 were foreign citizens. So a lot of people saying that tourism, of course, is going to be affected. Combination of Bardo and Sousse attack in Tunisia today will sadly mean a significant drop in tourism. So a lot of concern for the knock-on effect of these attacks, which won't just hurt tourism, says Andrew Leibovich. They hurt confidence in the government, foreign investment, and broader repercussions as well. Some using that somewhat tired refrain now, I think, Francois, of je suis in support for the places that have been affected by these attacks. Kuwait as well, we saw today, and of course Isère. Others pointing out that these attacks took place during the holy month of Ramadan. So hashtags have been created to point out the fact that this organisation that claims to be Islamic is committing these attacks during a month that is a holy month. On the one hand, IS definitely uses Western media as a way to spread propaganda, but on the other hand, shouldn't we know? Now, this is in relation, Francois, to frequent calls over the last number of months for a media blackout of Islamic State organisation activities. Of course, what the events of today, not all of them have been linked to the Islamic State organisation, but of course it does show how difficult it is for the media to cover events as they happen when it actually does also play into the strategy.
It's a huge dilemma, Sylvie Kaufmann, because we get constantly, it's a newsroom discussion here. They're sort of hijacking the news cycle, aren't they? And they're succeeding at it.
Yes, with these pictures and orchestrations. I think we just have to stick to our values and professional standards. This is the best we can.
And point out where possible that there is a media attempt to utilise the media. As for in France, I think a lot of criticism as well for some of the political reactions today. Many politicians, such as Nadine Morano and others, mentioning the so-called fifth column, which is the idea of an enemy within, which perhaps...
she's on the right.
She's on the political right. Christian Estrosi as well, the mayor of Nice, mentioning this whole
He's
idea
also on the right.
Yes.
Others speaking about the recently passed spy law, strengthening the resources of France's Secret Service, saying, well, this is proof, this latest attack is proof that we need these legislative tools. So a lot of talk today online, Francois, about the various aspects of all of that, knock-on effects.
All right, many thanks, James Creedon. Many thanks to our panelists. Thank you for being with us here for The World This Week.